Okay, good. Is this on? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, well, good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I'll just go ahead and jump right in. So in January of 2007, I began an ethnographic study of heterosexual gender relations at Umoja Temple, that's what I'm calling it, which is a self-proclaimed progressive Black church in the Bay Area, California. A few weeks into the study, though, I was surprised to discover that the pastor and the congregation were socially and politically supportive of homosexuality, which was a complete contrast from the homophobic rhetoric I understood to be typical of many churches, especially Black churches. Upon discussing his theological approach to homosexuality with the pastor, I found it odd that there was not a gay and lesbian presence within the congregation. But then the pastor informed me that, in fact, there was a significant and growing gay and lesbian population in the church, but he acknowledged that I wouldn't have known it because they're, quote, in the closet. So by mid-February 2007, my ethnographic study of heterosexual gender relations shifted to the current project. So during 18 months of ethnography, informal interviews, and 8 formal interviews, I discovered that, as expected, because Umoja Temple's pro-homosexual stance, a growing number of gay men, and I can talk more about what happened with lesbians during the question and answer if you'd like. This paper is going to focus on the gay men. They chose Umoja as their home church precisely because they felt it was an inclusive and what they called a safe space. But despite this fact, they overwhelmingly refused to come out and had no intentions of doing so. So if they admittedly chose this church precisely because they felt homosexuality was welcomed and accepted by the pastor and by the congregation, why did so many of the gay men at this church pass or cover as heterosexual? So stigma management theory seems like a logical starting point for trying to make sense of this paradox. Stigma management theory is premised on the notion that individuals are ultimately motivated to reveal their stigmas because they want people to see the real them, or their true selves. So I call this identity congruence. It's where individuals seek to make the social identity that's interactionally attributed to them by others congruent with their self-concept or their overarching view of themselves. So although identity congruence motivates stigma avowal, it cannot be ignored that revealing a stigma, of course, can be met with harsh social consequences. Therefore, attaining identity congruence relies heavily on the degree of stigma acceptance one anticipates in a given social context. So there are many information management studies that have sought to understand how context conditions degrees of stigma avowal. And overwhelmingly, these studies conclude that positive context is often a precondition for revealing a stigma. So for example, Herrick and Blunt in one of their studies conclude that homosexuals are, quote, more likely risk of voluntarily disposing their sexual orientation to heterosexuals from whom they expect a positive response. So although it offers useful insights, it being stigma management theory, for explaining behavior, it does appear to be inadequate for explaining the behavior in the present study. After all, these guys chose a context precisely because it was accepting and welcoming toward individuals with their stigma, yet they overwhelmingly chose not to reveal their stigmas. So I argue that in order for stigma management theory to accurately explain this empirical phenomenon, it requires a conceptual shift that emphasizes how context conditions configurations of meaning around a stigmatized attribute. So Irving Goffman, who was sort of the godfather of stigma, so he asserted that stigma should be seen in the language of relationships between attributes and stereotypes in order to emphasize that no attribute is inherently meaningful until social interaction imbues it with meaning, or in the case of stigma, a meaning that is negative or stereotypic. But then he disregards his own advice when he writes that, quote, there are important attributes that are almost everywhere in our society discredited. So because those attributes transcend contextual dependency, they render the attribute stereotype relationships superfluous and emerge as these monolithic stigmas. So consistent with this reasoning, stigma management research, more specifically sexual stigma research, overdetermines the effects of stigma by conceptualizing it as an enduring, monolithic, stable identity. While it is true that attributes, many of them, such as homosexuality, do tend to retain a stigmatized identity across social contexts, I argue Their socially imputed meaning and the meanings processed by individuals with the attribute may change from one context to another. After all, what is a homosexual or gay identity? To what extent is the meaning of a socially or self-ascribed homosexual identity shaped by social context? And how do those contextual meanings interact with the layers of identity that comprise the self-concept to ultimately affect stigma management decisions? So for the men in my study, in the context of their former churches, the meaning of homosexuality was ideologically associated with extreme immorality, sexual perversity. They were flooded with messages that homosexuality was not only a sin, but an abomination. They were going to go to hell. So I had to consider then, in the context of Umoja Temple, two very important questions. What did it mean to be black, male, and heterosexual? Because heterosexual, black male, and heterosexual is what these guys were passing as. So what I found was that although respondents felt it was tempered with the less, what they called macho construction, a heteronormative black masculinity was very salient at Umoja Temple. So the next important question was, what did it mean to be black, male, and homosexual? So, effeminophobia. Effeminophobia is this term that Eve Sedgwick has used to describe this conceptual need to interrupt a long tradition of viewing gender and sexuality as continuous and collapsible categories, a tradition of assuming that anyone, male or female, who desires a man must therefore be feminine. So indeed, many scholars have detailed the pervasiveness of this conflation. More specifically, since political dominance remains foreclosed for black men, group solidarity that privileges hegemonic black masculinity is seen as crucial to black survival in America, even or especially at the expense of those who exist at the margins of blackness. So E. Patrick Johnson, whom I understand just gave a talk here a few months ago, alludes to this dynamic when he states that, quote, the representation of effeminate homosexuality as disempowering is at the heart of the politics of hegemonic blackness. For to be ineffectual is one of the most damaging things one can be in the fight against oppression. Insofar as ineffectiveness is problematically sutured to femininity and homosexuality within a cultural politic that privileges race over other categories of oppression, it follows that the subjects accorded these attributes are marginalized and excluded from the boundaries of blackness. So Johnson's comment points to the double bind of black male homosexuality. Not only does it rob you of your masculinity, but it also robs you of your blackness. So for black males who accept a homosexual social identity, the stakes for masculinity are therefore very high. Charles, one of my respondents, described this difficulty in the following way. As African American men, our masculinity has been stolen since the day we've gotten here. We've being able to protect and take care of our families, protect our women, protect our children. That's one of the manliest things that you could possibly do. But you know, that's something that black men have not had a choice from day one getting on this land that we live on now. Our women were right in front of our faces. There was nothing we could do about our kids who were raped, they were stolen and sold. So that being incorporated with masculinity, I think it has some deep-seated stuff in the African American community that we really need to take a look at. End quote. So Charles acknowledged the history as he'd often heard it told, but asserted that framing black masculinity through such a definitively heteronormative lens had led to what he called deep-seated stuff, which he later clarified as the alienation of black gay men. So this ideological association of effeminacy with black male homosexuality extended into this very inclusive space of Umoja Temple. For example, Daryl, another one of my respondents, was at a men's retreat, and he recalled that during the retreat, when they're discussing homosexual inclusion in this very positive way, and homosexuality, it's good, it's fine, it's wonderful, he nonetheless overheard one of the presumably heterosexual guys whisper to another, you know, a guy that sleeps with another man, he just ain't a man. So at Umoja Temple, being black male and homosexual meant being effeminate, even if one was not flamboyantly or obviously so in appearance and style. Even though the Umoja community tried to fully include homosexuals, detaching homosexuality from these other ideological connotations of sinfulness and abomination and going to hell, the ideological association of effeminacy with being a gay man seemed to remain constant. However, we cannot explain their behavior, why they chose to come out or not to come out, until we understand how the configurations of meaning around that attribute of homosexuality correspond with an individual's self-concept. Positive reception notwithstanding, the degree to which gay men would have socially claimed homosexuality therefore relied on the degree to which effeminacy was congruent with their self-concepts. So Todd, Daryl, Charles, and Alan, 4 of these guys, were invested in masculine self-concepts. All 4 of these men admitted to me during interviews that they were not openly gay at Umoja Temple. In the end, it was important for them to attain identity congruence by presenting themselves as acceptably masculine. Therefore, despite Umoja Temple's acceptance of homosexuality, which these guys found appealing, coming out to the congregation meant compromising a form of overt masculinity in which they were invested and running the risk of taking on an effeminate social identity. Conversely, the 2 respondents, Gerald and Anthony, whose self-concept was more aligned with effeminacy, found identity congruence in coming out as gay with the connotation of an effeminate social identity. Gerald and Anthony recognized the social conflation of homosexuality with femininity, but they didn't mind it because it wasn't dissonant with the forms of being masculine in which they were invested. Both of them regarded themselves as more feminine than masculine. Their stylistic choices, carriage, and behavioral decisions signaled effeminacy to the degree that Anthony often felt he had to suppress his mannerisms in certain contexts for the sake of his partner, Todd, who was not openly gay in the church. So masculinity was not Gerald and Anthony's fight. Therefore, being openly gay at Umoja Temple, and they were the only 2 who were, was an easy decision to make for Gerald and would have been just as easy for Anthony if he didn't have his partner, Todd, to consider. So then returning to stigma management theory, identity congruence asserts that individuals are motivated to behave in a way that will make their social identity consistent with their self-concept. Positive social contexts help make it possible for individuals to attain identity congruence by revealing their stigmas. I argue empirical application of that logic is not as simple as assuming a monolithic meaning for a social identity that an individual then needs to make congruent with a self-concept. Instead, one should carefully attend to the negotiations within the contextual configurations of meaning that inform the attribute being studied. Ultimately, what individuals manage is meaning. I therefore offer a framework of meaning management to extend and add more nuance to the theorizing of how individuals manage stigma and the presentation of identity more generally. Thank you.